Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to part dose of the audiovisual series we've done. And thanks again so much to Casey and Rebecca for undertaking this and helping us learn more about audiovisual materials and dealing with that. And I'm really excited, I'm sure everyone is, to learn more about the digital component inside of the audiovisual world. So one little NEA Reps promotional thing. I just wanted to let everyone know that on May 16th we're having Core Fest to collide with Porch Fest, which is happening in Somerville. So Porch Fest is a music sort of festival. It's community based, and that's going on from 12 to 6. And our Core Fest is tours of archives in the Boston area. We have 3 tracks. Track 1 is at the Mass Historical Society, and the second site is the American Jewish Historical Society of New England Archives and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Oh, both of them? 2 for 1. 2 for 1. Oh my gosh, you could say now. Well, because maybe you want to go to Group 2 option, which is Congress Archives in the morning, and then the USS Constitutional Museum and Archives in the afternoon. And then Group 3, lucky them, gets to go to the Bostonian Society and Old State House, and then Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra Archives in the afternoon. So there's still some room if anyone's interested. I just wanted to let you guys know about that, and I will put those by the food, so as you are mingling, you can maybe just write your name down if you want, if you haven't signed up. So I'll put that in the back, and then I will let our ladies go.
I have a couple of other announcements. First off, if you weren't here last time, I'm Casey. I work at WGBH as the project manager for the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. And this is?
I'm Rebecca. I'm the National Digital Stewardship Resident at WGBH. And I work with Casey on the American Archive and also on digital preservation projects and the rest of the media library and archive.
And last time we talked about analog video material and how to get a handle on what you have, how to identify the different formats, and how to develop an inventory once you have assembled a collection and have acquired a video collection. But today we wanted to move into the digital sphere and talk about the components of digital files, and then spend some time on figuring out, once you have a digital collection, once you get your $500,000 grant to digitize your whole video collection, what really can you do with it given the rights issues that may be present. So we'll spend the second half talking about copyright issues related to audiovisual materials. But before we get started, another Reps plug. Well, first off, congratulations to Kristen and Betts on being the new SCOSAA co-chairs. But there are more opportunities for leadership within New England Archivists. Next March, Rose, Dan, and I will no longer be on the steering committee for Reps, which is the roundtable for early professionals and students, which is a really active group, and we really love collaborating with SCOSAA. So if you're interested, I would really recommend getting involved with Reps and thinking about going for a leadership position in Reps next March. And finally, another plug is GBH recently got a grant called the American Archive of Public Broadcasting National Digital Stewardship Residency. So we will be building off of the Boston NDSR program and expanding the program to focus specifically on audiovisual digital preservation and placing 8 residents at public media organizations across the country in 10-month residencies. It'll be, paid position focusing on managing the digital assets of a public media organization. And and the mentorship component will be a little bit different because you'll be, spread out across the country, and your cohort will be spread out across the country. But we're really excited in exploring how to maintain the cohort environment while being, at diverse public media organizations across the country and maintaining the network that you have. So really excited about that. And the residencies will begin next October, but the call for resident applicants will be next spring. So that's another opportunity. And I will hand it off to Rebecca to get started.
Hey. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the technical components of digital video files that you might want to be aware of if you're going to start dealing with digital video in your collections. preservation class are pretty familiar with like file formats and some of the technical issues there. So just to do a quick refresher, when you're talking about digital items, you generally think of something as having a file format, and that's how you define it and you preserve that format. So for example, something like a text file is the TXT format, something like a PDF-A that's an archival format, and that's a standard for how we preserve it and how the bits and bytes are arranged in a certain way. For video, it gets a little bit more complicated. So there's really no such thing as a video format. There are codecs and wrappers, and when you put those things together, those make up what we think of as the video format. So the codec, it stands for coder decoder. It's basically the way that the video information is written in such a way that when a program reads it, it can create the output that is the video that we want to see. So there's a little diagram right here just for kind of how when you start with like a collection of code that is then fed into your player, and the player's like, oh, I have an algorithm for how to interpret this, and then what you get is video. But you don't just have a codec with a video file. That codec is surrounded by a digital container format. And usually, because with a video file, you'll have a video stream, an audio stream, maybe some metadata, maybe some subtitles, maybe some time code. All of those things need to be collected and stored together. And those are put inside a wrapper format. So if you see something that says .mov, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a QuickTime file. It means that it's in a QuickTime wrapper, and there could be any number of codecs inside that QuickTime wrapper. So you can kind of see in the diagram here, you know, a QuickTime wrapper could have an uncompressed video and audio codec inside it. Some wrappers will only contain one sort of codec. They're only designed for that. So Windows Media will pretty much only ever have a Windows Media video and a Windows Media audio inside. It's proprietary, and those things fit together, and that's all it understands how to interpret. But for most of the ones that we use nowadays, any one wrapper could contain multitudes. So that's kind of the first thing you need to understand when you're looking at digital video, is that the thing that you see as that, that extension at the end of your file does not tell you anywhere near everything you need to know about the format. So you've probably all seen this kind of little window pop up when you try and play something, and it'll tell you that your player doesn't have the required codec and you need to go download it. Sometimes if you see this, this will mean that your video is broken. But most of the time it'll just mean that it's a more complicated codec that your player don't understand. So I've seen people assume that their video is broken just because their player can't play it. And most of the time that assumption is not correct, and you'll want to just take a look and figure out what's actually going on with that video that makes it more complicated than what your standard player is going to be able to interpret. So one of the most important characteristics of codecs is whether they're lossy or lossless. How many of you guys are familiar with this term? So again, just overview. When it's a lossy codec, basically it means that it compresses it in such a way that information is permanently gone, you can't get it back. When it's lossless, it means that it's compressed in such a way that it's kind of algorithmically able to be decoded such that you can get the full file back if you wanted to. So if you wanted to uncompress it, you could, if it's a lossless codec. If it's a lossy codec, then what's gone is gone. And that's really important when you're talking about digital video, because you're going to have to make a lot of choices if you're thinking about digital video in terms of compression and in terms of file size, because uncompressed video is just too big for most institutions to handle. So when you're making your choices about your preservation quality video, you really want to be thinking, first of all, about lossy and lossless and what kind of information you can afford to lose. So just to talk quickly about some common video codecs, you've probably all seen some of these. H.264 and MPEG-4 is what you'll see. These things aren't exactly the same, but for to intents and purposes, we'll talk about them as the same. Are mostly what you'll see around the web. It's streaming video. It's what goes onto YouTube. It's what most people are going to want for an access copy because it makes it really easy to put it up with almost any web player. MPEG-2, slightly older format, is what goes on DVDs. So that's also very common for access. Motion JPEG 2000 is the lossless compressed video format that the Library of Congress uses as its preservation standard. There are problems with it. There's a big argument. If you go into the moving image preservation world, you'll see big fights between the people who are proponents of Motion JPEG 2000 and the people who are proponents of FFV1, which is a more recent lossless compressed video format that has started to be used in archives as well as around the web for to preserve video in high quality formats. Apple ProRes is a proprietary format, but it's very common, especially in production houses. So you'll see it a lot. People will often use it for mezzanine files if they want something that is pretty widely accessible and is very, high quality enough to be worked with, and they'll be able to kind of ensure that their players will be able to deal with it, even though the fact that it's proprietary means that it's not a great choice for long-term preservation. These uncompressed formats, or codecs, are what you'll often get out of an analog to digital converter. So if you use like an Aja or a Blackmagic to digitize your video, you can get a giant uncompressed file, which will usually be wrapped in a QuickTime or an AVI wrapper. DV is the format that went along with the actual DV digital tapes. And because it was used, those were used for production and were commonly used for a really long time. Now you can get DV files that were never on a tape, that are just born digital, but in the DV format. Because again, production houses would often work with it, and we're used to working with video in that format. Some common video wrappers, again, you're probably familiar with these. QuickTime is the one you'll see most often. QuickTime and MP4 are probably the ones that are most common in consumer use. AVI is another common one. There are some tricks to AVI. For example, I had a problem where I didn't realize when I was first doing a lot of video transcoding that AVI couldn't handle pixels that weren't square. And I'll talk about aspect ratio in a moment, but the end result was because of AVI's technical limitations, I ended up with videos that were in the wrong aspect ratio and squashed. And I had to go back and fix that because I hadn't understood when I was making that choice about what format I was digitizing to, how that would impact the outcome. MXF and Matroska you'll often see in preservation quality video. MXF is what JPEG 2000 files are usually wrapped in, and Matroska is what FFV1 or MKV is what FFV1 files are usually wrapped in. Both of those are capable of handling a number of different streams, including a lot of metadata information, a lot of different subtitle information that some of the more common consumer formats can't really handle. So that's why you'll see those bandied around a lot when you're talking about preservation quality video.
How come, sorry, question.
Yeah, no, please.
How come there's such a fight between the JPEG 2000 and FFV1? Like, why is FFV1 better, or is it just because like Library of Congress is used to it?
I'm gonna try and stay neutral on this one.
Okay.
JPEG 2000 is, because it's the Library of Congress standard, there are good reasons to use it, but it is much less, like Motion JPEG and NXF are both much more not proprietary, but much less widely adopted than FFV1 and MKV. On the other hand, FFV1 hasn't been adopted like as a standard yet, like it hasn't been officially formally given the seal of approval. So for people who are cautious, and a lot of archivists are cautious, we want to know that something's been given the seal of approval, that it's a standard. We like having standards. And Motion JPEG 2000 is a standard. And MXF is a standard even if it's one that's difficult to decode and not widely adopted. So that's kind of the heart of the argument. I tend to lean more towards FFV1, but there are very valid reasons to go with JPEG 2000.
And it's like Library of Congress, like the person who grants, like who makes it official?
It's the national or the international standards organization.
Yeah, it's ISO. The same people who I was looking for the acronym, but not finding it.
But then the Library of Congress endorsed.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's a combination of various different agencies that kind of put their seal of approval on it. Like OAIS, the repository model, is an ISO standard.
Okay.
So a lot of the stuff that if you're working in archives, you want to try and work with materials and models that are standardized, if at all possible. But the standardization process is slow, and digital video moves fast.
Right.
And FFV1 is also, it is smaller than JPEG 2000, which is nice if you're looking at space limitations. It's smaller and faster to work with, which is why I like it.
And you're going to have to migrate in a few years anyway.
Yeah, no matter what. Probably whatever format you pick, you're probably going to migrate within a few years. But we'll get to that. So one of the main characteristics that you're going to look at when you're talking about audio and video, and that will vary the quality of the video that you're getting regardless, of the format that you choose are sample rate and bit depth. I started with audio because it's easiest, I think, to talk about these concepts with audio. It's very easy to understand that if you have an analog audio file, that's a wave. An analog is like a wave of sound wave, right? So when you're trying to transfer that into video, you're basically slicing it into yes/no points, ones and zeros, bits and bytes. So you can't get a perfect wave, but you want to get something, because digital doesn't do curves. Digital just does a series of steps. But you want to get something as close to that curve as possible. So the way you get that is by sampling at certain time intervals. So you want to slice those time intervals as thin as possible, so you're getting as many samples as possible. And you also want to have as many different steps as possible. So if you're looking at 16-bit, you can see with the diagram here, there are only these such and such a number of different steps, different sounds that you can capture. And if you go up to 24-bit, that exponentially increases the number of different sounds you can capture. So it's a matter of how fast you're capturing and what the different variety of sound is. That's what we call the bit depth when it comes to audio. When it comes to video, when we're talking about bit depth, we're usually talking about color. So for preservation quality video, you'll see people talking about 10-bit. It's referring to the number of bits used per color channel per pixel. So 10-bit video is actually 1024 different color samples that can be captured, as opposed to 8-bit, which is 256 different color ranges. So the more different kinds, like different steps of color can be captured, the better your video is going to approximate that analog quality. And this is important when you're talking about something that's coming from an analog tape or from film. You're also going to hear people talking, in addition to bit depth, you're going to hear people talking about color space. And that's basically the way that color is encoded on the video. So usually when you're talking, like, since we've developed ways of capturing video and film, we've been using 3 channel systems to create color. And those channels were kind of sent separately, often through different wires or one at a time. And then, like with originally with television, you kind of combine the signals back together because all that color information was just too much to send at once. And it also has to do with the way the color is captured in the camera. It'll be captured in different chips and then combined back together. So most digital cameras right now capture RGB color, and you can kind of see in this really nice diagram here. What that basically is it's capturing red, green, and blue, and then just putting it together to make the nice color image that you see. TV and video capture YUV color, and what that means is Y is luminance, and U and V are basically just red and blue. But by capturing like the background, the overall luminance, like black and white image, how much light there is and how much dark there is in each portion of the image, and then overlaying the color over it, you actually have to transfer less information. It's a more efficient way of capturing color. And it's also much closer to the way that in the analog world, TV and video would send color, when it would be luminance, and then the 2 different color signals would go after that. So if you have a video file, and I'll talk about this more later, you don't want to change what the color space it's in. But if you're digitizing video, you'll usually want to go with YUV, because you're coming from analog, and that will approximate what the color is on analog better. Again, you don't need to fully understand all the algorithms here or anything, but just when it comes up, so you can understand what's being talked about if you're talking about it with a vendor or with a donor. Chroma subsampling, last thing about color. So there is one more factor with color, and that is how frequently it's sampled when it's being digitized, or when it's being captured in the camera. And I just have all this text right here because I know I wasn't going to remember how to explain it right if I wasn't reading it off the slide. So I apologize, I'm going to read off the slide. 444 is it's the absolute highest quality. You're almost never going to see this in the wild. If you are a big film producer with a massive budget and you are digitizing like a prestige, like you're digitizing Casablanca for the first time. And no, you're not, because Casablanca's supposed to be black and white. You're digitizing, what's a famous color film? Yes, you're digitizing Wizard of Oz for the first time, and you want the absolute highest color it is technologically possible to capture. You might go for 444. 422 is what you'll see most of the time for preservation quality video, for broadcast quality video, for anyone that's doing it professionally. So what that means is you're sampling the light channel, and then you're sampling the two color channels each half as often as you're getting the light channel. 420 alternates sampling between the two color channels. This is what you'll see in most access formats, like many formats on the web, on DVD. One little factoid, a lot of consumer QuickTime players can't interpret 422. They'll tell you the video is broken. It's not. It's just a higher quality than they're used to handling. 411, very low-end consumer formats. Two color channels sampled at a quarter of the rate of the light channel. So the light channel, the rate that you're sampling luminance stays the same. It's how frequently you're sampling the color. And then if it's at a lower sampling rate, the video format kind of extrapolates the rest. So it's not as accurate. You don't really need to know exactly, again, you don't need to know the technical algorithms for all of this. But you need to know what they're talking about when they say 444, 422, so you can make an informed choice if that option comes up to make a choice. All right, moving away from color. Aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is the relationship between the width of an image and the height of an image. You can kind of see here, here's a stretched image, here's an image that looks right. Changing the aspect ratio, you can basically mess up the aspect ratio and your video will still be fine. It's pretty easily fixable a lot of the time because there's different ways you can get that algorithm of the aspect ratio. There's pixel aspect ratio, which is how big each individual pixel in an image is. A lot of the times it'll be square, but actually most of the time for video that's created nowadays, it's rectangular. So the pixels themselves aren't square, and they contribute to that aspect ratio. Sample aspect ratio is how, basically, pixel aspect ratio times sample aspect ratio equals the display aspect ratio, what you actually see. So sample aspect ratio is how many actual pixels by how many actual pixels. Pixel aspect ratio is how the pixels are configured in what mathematical format. And then when you multiply those two things, you get what you actually see. So if you're looking at the metadata on a video, what you'll generally just show you, it'll show you the display aspect ratio, it'll just say this is a 4:3 video. And you might have to look at more detailed technical metadata to figure out what's making it a 4:3 video. Is it really 4:3? Is it 16:9 with squashed pixels? And you might have to know what that means if you're going to be transcoding. And you may well be transcoding. But before I talk about transcoding, I'm just going to talk a little bit about digitized video versus born digital video. So we talked about this a little bit in the last workshop, if you were here. But basically, there are many formats that are actually digital video on tape. So like these DV tapes is actually a digital file written onto tape. And then, you have born digital video created all the time, in cameras, in cell phones, and more as archivists, we're going to be seeing that come into our collections. People are going to be donating it, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. And then there's analog, which, as I said before, is actually wave signals written down on a tape, captured completely differently from a digital file. So the choices that you make when you're dealing with digital files that you're taking into your collection are going to be very different when you're talking about a digitized video versus a born digital video. If you're digitizing your analog collection, then you're going to want to capture at the highest quality possible, and I'll talk a little bit about specs for that in a second. But if you have a file that's already a digital file, most of the time you're not going to want to up-res it. You're not going to want to try and make it better, because you can't make it better. What you've got is what you've got. And you want to try and preserve those technical characteristics as much as you possibly can. So I've heard people try and talk about capturing DV at 10-bit uncompressed, and you can't do that because it's not uncompressed. There's no analog there to uncompress. It's just the file that it is. So that's a really important thing to think about. And it basically means there's two characteristics of digital video, or two characteristics of video that you need to treat different ways, even if they're all digital now. One important thing about analog video as opposed to digital video is that it's interlaced, or much of it is interlaced. So interlacing was a weird technical process that was invented in the television era in order, again, that they wouldn't have to send as much information to everyone's televisions and clog it up, but they could send less information at a time and put the two signals together. Instead of sending a whole frame and then a whole frame and then a whole frame, it was half a frame and half a frame. And because it was going so fast, your eye kind of fools you and it looks like a whole frame. This looks great on an analog television, but I don't know if any of you guys have seen actual analog video on a digital television. It doesn't look that great. You can actually see the different, the different lines kind of flickering because digital televisions aren't designed to put those things together in the same way. So when you have an analog video that you're transferring, it's really tempting to talk about deinterlacing it. And when you're making an access copy, a lot of times you want to do that because people will complain if it looks like this and what they're expecting is something that looks like this. But whenever you, and there are many algorithms with whatever video program you're using or your vendor is using that will allow you to do that and will kind of mathematically put the two half frames together and deinterlace it. But it's important to remember that whenever you do that, you're losing information. The actual deinterlaced output that you've gotten is losing, it's less clear and you're losing information from the original. So you might want to do it for your access copy. I recommend, we've always done it for our access copies wherever I've worked, but you never want to do that for your master file because it will lose characteristics of the original. So, preservation, quality, digitization. If you are digitizing a video collection, these are basically, there aren't standards, but these are kind of the best practices that have shuffled out after years and years of people arguing about them. And there are still arguments, people are still arguing about them. But generally people will say you want a 10-bit uncompressed codec, or you can have lossless compression. So either 10-bit uncompressed V210, which is exactly what comes out of your analog digital converter, or one of the other UVUI or one of the other uncompressed codecs. Or you can transcode to JPEG 2000, which is lossless and a standard, or to FBON, which is lossless and a standard. But generally those are the only things you're going to want for preservation, quality, analog digitized video. You'll want YUV color space, you'll want 4:2 sampling, you want to preserve the original aspect ratio, so you want to know what the original aspect ratio is. You want an open, common, widely used wrapper, so something like QuickTime or AVI. And for your audio, you want 48 kilohertz, 24-bit PCM. Yes?
Are you going to give us copies of these slides, or should we be frantically?
I will be giving copies of the slides.
okay.
I won't be giving copies of the slides, but they'll be made available. I don't have USBs in my pocket. But yes, this will all be available, so you can take a look at this. Just for a note on the audio, this is a video-focused workshop, so I'm not going too in-depth into audio. But for the record, the actual standard for high-quality audio is 98 kilohertz per second?
96.
Or 96, sorry, yes. But when it's captured alongside a video on a tape, the actual quality of the audio on the tape is not as high as a full reel of audio tape. So 48 is about as high as you can get off a videotape. So you want your preservation file if you're digitizing. Then you want, sometimes you'll want a mezzanine file, and that's going to depend on the context. So if you work in a broadcast environment like Casey and I do, a lot of times you'll have people coming back and want to work with that video. They'll want to be able to edit it into things. Or if you're, you're working in a corporate environment and this video is stuff that people are going to want to edit into promotional reels or whatever it is. If you think someone might want to go back and work with a high quality version of that video, you're probably going to want a format that's not your preservation file, because your preservation file is going to be difficult to work with. It's large, it's clunky, it's slow. It's going to make every video editing system that you put it in slow. So you want something that's high quality, but still small enough and fast enough that if you put it in Final Cut or you put it in whatever, then they're actually going to be able to use it and it's going to be able to interpret it. So we call that a mezzanine file or a production master, and you might use a DV50 codec or a ProRes or even a high quality H.264. And then you're going to want, almost certainly you're going to want an access file. No matter what kind of institution you're in, if you want to be able to allow people to view it, you don't want people viewing your master file because again, it's going to be slow. And if you had you don't want to have 4 copies of your master file because, you do if you have geographically dispersed storage. but that's not what you want to be giving out to people or streaming or putting on a DVD or whatever it is you want to do. So you would have a smaller file, maybe an H.264, maybe an MPEG-2, that's suitable for web playback or streaming or institutional viewing, or maybe you just put it on a DVD. Any questions while I'm running back over here? Normalizing for preservation. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about this, how you're almost certainly going to be transcoding no matter what kind of file you have. So you might or might not be decide to normalize your files for preservation if you're taking them in. If you're at an institution that is receiving digital video of any kind, a lot of institutions do make the decision to immediately transcode that file into something that they know they'll be able to preserve in the future. Especially if it's some kind of weird format, if it's like a lot of camera raw formats are very difficult to work with. And it's a lot easier to say, okay, we know how to preserve FMV1, or we know how to preserve QuickTime, and we don't know how to preserve whatever this weird red camera raw thing is that we just got. And then a lot of times they'll decide not to keep the original video that they got because uncompressed video or camera raw video is very costly in terms of storage space and processing time. So if you can't afford to keep the originals of all you've got, and you want to make sure that you've got video that you can work with and can commit to preserving in the future, and that you can treat all your video the same way when it comes time to transcode again into the future, because codecs will go obsolete, and it will be eventually time to transcode again for preservation. That's one of the things that we know about digital preservation. It's a lot easier if you know that, okay, I've just got this whole bunch of JPEG 2000 files, and I can just write a script or set up a program to do the same thing to each and every one. So that's why you might want to transcode as soon as you get something in, and why a lot of institutions do transcode as soon as they get something in. You might not want to do that, and there are good reasons not to do it also. So the first reason is just for all the reasons I've been saying. I've been talking to you guys for the past half hour about various different complex technical characteristics of video files. And if you're not sure you can preserve all of those things accurately, like it takes a lot of planning to look at a video file and be like, okay, if it's this aspect ratio, and if it's that chroma, color space, and if it's that chroma subsampling, then I'm going to transcode it to this thing. And if you don't have the time or the ability to do that planning, it may be safer to just keep the video in its original format. Also, I mean, we're archivists. We like hanging on to the originals of things. It's not always possible to restore the original from a transcoded version. In some cases, you can't just transcode it back and expect to have what you got, or what you put in. And lastly, every technological process you put a file through, no matter what, provides an opportunity for error or corruption. So it is somewhat risky not to transcode the video and expect that thing that you transcoded to be your new preservation copy.
I was just going to ask, I thought, like I know the Library of Congress, they don't ever get rid of the masters. They do transcode them and they put them on the web and all that other stuff, but they're all in a big vault.
Well, that's actually not 100% true.
Oh, really? Okay.
For their digital video, I believe it is true. For their analog video, I know that they've
tossing?
I've seen them tossing pneumatics.
Okay.
They digitize
But
pneumatics.
Pneumatics isn't, I mean, that's not a master format. Pneumatics is what every library has. I mean, that's not what we originally shot in.
Oh no, but if it's what you've got, then that has to be, if it's the only thing you've got that's the only record of a certain video,
Oh, okay.
then that would have to be considered your master. Or if it was shot by by an amateur who didn't have access to a
Okay. I mean, every library in America has a million pneumatics.
Exactly.
Right. But I thought those weren't masters anyway, so.
They might be a master if it's the only thing you have, or if it's the original.
And so, do you think more archives are or are not holding on to? I mean, I thought possession was 9/10 of the law. Every archivist holds on to everything. We never throw away. We transfer it, but we hold on to it because it's ours. That kind of stuff. Is that not true? Or?
I mean, I haven't done a broad survey,
Yeah.
so I couldn't tell you anything for sure. Casey, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this at all.
I just wondered.
But I do know, especially when it comes to digital files, there's a lot of argument right now about how much we should and shouldn't hold, because it's infinitely replicable, right? So you could make as many copies as you want. You could create your original and create a master from your original, create a mezzanine and create another master, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But video, especially with video, it takes up massive amounts of storage space. It's very costly.
Digital video.
Digital video. Physical video does not take up more storage space than a book. But if you have lots of it, as every Congress had lots of their U-matics, even they can have storage problems.
But after you do the transfer, wouldn't you throw away the master? I mean,
We don't throw away the master.
Yeah,
Ideally, no.
nobody's
No.
throwing away masters, that's my question, right?
Me
Or mostly not throwing away.
For some formats, they're going to, not be able to play back in 10 years anyway. They'll be, dead.
They
Some
might,
of them
yeah.
already are, like DAT tapes. We're creating DAT tapes like 13 years ago, and now they won't play back.
Some people, throwing away is the wrong term, but when I say throw away, I mean don't dedicate to preserving or don't commit to preserving. So if you receive a hard drive with a bunch of camera raw files on it, what some institutions would do is they put that into their repository and they run it through whatever normalization software they had installed or whatever kind of file format it is. A lot of archives are doing this with all digital files or like something like Archivematica. You put it in, it'll normalize it, it'll create the preservation copy of that file, and then that's what goes into the repository. And the original thing, it's not like it's you immediately chuck it in the trash, but it sits on that hard drive, and it's not having the kind of preservation attention paid to it that the master copies are having paid to it. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And in some cases, alternately, so the alternate option for that would be, instead of normalizing it and intaking your normalized file into the repository, you would just put your original file into the repository and commit to preserving that. And that's a choice, it's not necessarily a right or a wrong choice. It's just whatever better suits the needs of your institution and your institution's technological capabilities. Tools. So these tools are going to be your best friends if you're handling digital video at all. And I'm actually going to do a brief demo. I can get out of this. So media info is basically just a tool to figure out what's going on, like what the technical characteristics of your video are. So it's a command line tool. There's also a GUI, a graphical user interface version. I'm used to using the command line version, so I'm just going to show you the command line version because I think it's really easy. All you have to do is download it. Then you type media info and drag and drop your video file. Find the video file. Where's the video file? Here we go. Drag and drop it, hit enter, and it's telling me all these things about the video file. So I have my format, my codec, how long it is, what the bit rate is, everything about the format profile, because all the formats have different profiles and different versions and get much more complicated than the high-level version that I just gave you. What the aspect ratio is, what the width and height, what the color space is, etc., etc. And if I want even more info than that, I can type mediainfo-f, which means full, and do the same thing again, and I will get so much more information that I don't even know what to do with.
And doesn't the user interface allow you to export into different XML?
Yeah, the command line interface does that as well. So when you get more, you can play around with media info, you can find out more about what it actually does. You can export PB core. You can export a number of different metadata standards and get all that technical information in something you can just plop into whatever record you want. It's really useful. Or you can just grab what you need in order if you're trying to make a decision about how to handle a video file. FFmpeg is much more complex. I'm just going to show you what it does for metadata for right now, but it's basically a free and open source video editing tool. So it can tell you stuff about your video as well. Sometimes it'll tell you slightly different information than your media info is, and you've got to look closer to figure out why it's telling you different things. FFprobe is the metadata variant of it. And that'll also tell me, duration, what the streams are, what the aspect ratios are. So you see it's, the sample aspect ratio is 1:1, but the display aspect ratio is 40:27, and that's what gives it the actual aspect ratio that it has. And all the other technical information kind of comes in here. And you can do a lot more stuff with it. I could turn this video into an H.264 using just FFmpeg if I wanted to. I'm not going to show you doing that right now because it's more complicated. But if you're interested in doing work with digital video, I'd advise you to look it up and play around with it a little bit, because it can be invaluable, especially if you have a codec that you don't understand, or that your player can't handle, and you want to know more about it, or you want to see if it's actually broken. 9 times out of 10, this is actually one other thing I'll show you. If you type ffplay, 9 times out of 10, ffplay will be able to play it. This is a highly, highly compressed video, by the way. As you can see. It's also just the blockiness is the compression. Everything else is because the video that I digitized it from was like half melted. But yeah, so testing a video that you're not sure about with ffplay will sometimes give you an answer as to whether it's actually broken or whether it's just in a codec that you don't know or that your player doesn't know or recognize. So that's one of the things that makes it a very useful tool. Back to my PowerPoint. How do I get back into slideshow view? There we go.
Before you move on, could you say something about like the importance of keeping this technical metadata about
Yes.
your files?
Good call, Casey. So you want to, the reason that these tools are so important, aside from just telling you what you might want to do with the video in the moment, is that in the future, having all that technical metadata about a file will make it much easier when that file format may be obsolete, or when the player to play it may be obsolete, may no longer be easily findable and manufactured, to again understand the qualities of that video and better be able to preserve it in the future. So even if whatever you're currently using to try and play back the video can't understand it, if you have this technical metadata, you can look at it and be like, oh, these are all the characteristics of the file format. And now I can figure out what player might be able to play that, how I might be able to keep providing access to it. So it's very important. Thank you, Casey. And lastly, before we take a break, I'm just going to talk very quickly about storage. So you guys have probably, if you take digital video classes, you've probably talked about storage. It's not that it's substantially different for digital video than for anything else. It's just that digital video files, as I've said before and will say again, if you're looking at preservation quality, are huge. So if you're digitizing a video collection, or if you're intaking a digital video collection, you really want to be sure that you have the capacities to provide the kind of storage that it will take. To provide, to make sure that you have your 2 geographically dispersed copies that you want to have in order to say that you're actually safeguarding this content. So different storage options might be, you might have it on a bunch of different hard drives. A lot of times if you don't have any resources, that's what you'll do, is you'll put one hard drive here with all your videos sitting on it, one hard drive over there with all your videos sitting on it, and hopefully replace them every couple of years because hard drives die fast, as we know. Not the best solution, but it's one a lot of people go for. You could have it all in a server system, which is, as you guys know, server, collection of linked hard drives that talk to each other and kind of cry out warnings when one of them is failing, so it's more secure than just having a single hard drive. It's a great simplification, but in essence. And you can put all of your video files on the server, and then it'll be easy to access and very swift, as it would be with a hard drive, but it will also be quite costly. Servers are probably the most expensive way of getting storage. You might put it on something like an LTO tape, which is what we do at WGBH. The advantages of that are that it's relatively cheap storage. So you can get 2.5 terabytes on one LTO tape for, what, like 50 bucks? Which in storage land is cheap, and you can put a lot of videos on there, even if your videos are 100 gigabytes big. The downside of that is that LTO tapes are finicky, they're hard to access, and eventually they will go obsolete, and then you'll have to replace all of them. But it's not immediate, because it's actually digital information stored on an analog tape. You put it in, you have to load it up, you wait for the player to find the point on the tape where it actually has that digital information. It can take a really long time. It's not immediate at all. So if you have stuff that you're going to want to access quickly, then you probably want to have it on a hard drive or a server. And lastly, the cloud. Who doesn't love the cloud? As we know, the cloud is not actually anything ethereal. It is just a bunch of someone else's servers. So it's nice because you don't have to worry about it and someone else is taking responsibility for it. But someone else is taking responsibility for it and you don't necessarily know how responsible they are or if they're going to be able to give everything back to you. So the cloud, not that I'm saying don't use the cloud, but use it cautiously. Maybe don't use it as your only backup or your only storage solution. Especially, again, when you have a very large file. A lot of times it's very easy to put stuff into the cloud, but very hard to get stuff back out. Or it's very cheap to store stuff in the cloud, as with Amazon Glacier, but expensive to get it back out, especially when it's 100 gigabytes big. So just stuff to think about when you're considering what your storage solutions are going to be for video.
There's different types of storage. For like LTO tape, you can store your preservation files, but you can use the cloud for storing your proxy files and being able to stream those to your patrons.
So, anyone have any questions before we take a break?
I think just another comment about the cloud stuff is also you have to consider what the options are for uploading it. Some vendors will allow you to send them a hard drive or something, and then that gets it up quickly, but it can take months to upload a terabyte or something of files, and video files especially are huge. So, you know, it can take, if you've got multiple terabytes of video files and you want to put them in the cloud, it could take 6 months to get the files up.
Exactly. I mean, what we have for another organization I work with, aside from WGBH, which is a community-based digitization initiative, we use the Internet Archive to provide access to the files that we provide because we don't store anything. We're basically just a service that digitizes them and then sends them to the Internet Archive and gives them back to the original partners that we work with. And when we're basically, we had to work out a deal with the Internet Archive where we were sending them hard drives every time we finished a cycle, and then they would manually upload everything from those hard drives there because we were capturing preservation quality files, and there's just no way to upload something that big. It's not doable. So you're going to have to get in, if you're using cloud storage at an institutional level, then you're probably going to have to get into a pretty close relationship with your storage provider to figure out just how to get them that data in the first place.
You talked about transcoding being a possibility for errors.
Yes.
And aside from errors you make about getting the format wrong and things like that, do you have actual personal experience with like a piece of software screwing up or the hard drive being corrupt? Like what actually happens with like an actual, like an inter-machine error?
We have a lot of experience with that at WGBH, actually. We had a lot of my project as the National Digital Stewardship President has been dealing with a number of file errors that we had while trying to pull stuff out of our digital asset management system over network storage and send them off to be included in the American Archive. And we actually had a 20% file failure rate. Just because we still haven't figured out exactly why that happened. In some cases, we think that the file may have gone corrupt on the LTO tape. In some cases, the file was clearly all right at its starting point, but only some of the data made it through. And we would get a file that was half the data that we actually wanted it to be, and half just gibberish, nonsense, bits and bytes, on the other end.
Is that mostly transmission errors, or is that like a bug in the software? I mean, like, do you see bugs in software, or is it just mostly like between like uploading and downloading something weird happens?
You do see bugs in software. You get glitches. When transcoding to JPEG 2000 or from JPEG 2000, I've had glitches. And you guys probably know about fixie checks and checksums and MD5s. There's actually an application for video called Fraimow MD5 that lets you go through and you can run a checksum on every frame of a video file and compare it against. And that way you can actually compare two files, one pre-transcode and one post-transcode against each other if it's a lossless transcoding process. So you can compare your uncompressed video file against your JPEG 2000 file using Fraimow MD5. Because if you have your checksum for those two files in and of themselves are obviously going to be different. But when it runs a checksum on the actual frame of the file, using the algorithms for JPEG 2000 that make it lossless, the checksum for each frame should actually be the same. And so we used to do that when I was working at an institution where we transcoded all our videos to JPEG 2000. Then we would run the Fraimow MD5 to make sure that the transcoding happened correctly, and occasionally we would see an error. And often it was a very small error or a glitch just in one frame. And we wouldn't have caught it if it wasn't for that Fraimow MD5.
And so when you do fixity checks on why are videos actually too big? Do they blow up if you take just the video as opposed to every frame?
No, I mean you might want to do that as well, but if you're checking, you do want to do that as well. You want to have a checksum for your whole video. But if what you want to do is check that your transcode happened properly, that your losslessly compressed file is actually a losslessly compressed file, The checksum for the whole thing won't be the same because the file itself is obviously not the same, it's compressed differently. But you can use FrameMP5 to make sure that your transcoding happened as it should, and there were no bugs or glitches that happened in the course of that transmission. Yes?
Things first on this, I believe FFmpeg may do a, maybe able to do a differential. So if you have the original, and then you have what you pulled out of dams, you compare them, and it'll
Yes.
show you, so you have an idea where to go to and take problems. But you had mentioned that it may be more expensive to get your data out of the cloud. Could you explain that?
Yeah, there are a lot of services, like Amazon Glacier is the one that I'm most familiar with, and it's very, very popular, where it's very, very cheap to store things. It's what, like 10 cents per gig? Yeah, 10 cents a gigabyte or even less to put your data up there. Because they want to attract people and you pay that monthly fee to keep on using their space. And you don't have to pay, I don't believe you pay a cost for initial upload. You just pay a fee to keep using that space. Because the fact that it's so cheap is predicated on the idea that this is data you will rarely ever want. So it's not costly for them to just store it passively. They have whatever cheap storage they are using to passively store that data. But when the data is required to come out, that's a lot more labor intensive. It often requires human intervention, it requires them to go back and check out metadata, it requires the computers to actually be doing something other than passively sitting and running, kind of normal checks. So that's when the prices go up. They will charge you for getting your data back because that's more work for them than just maintaining it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's like an insurance policy. If you never,
Exactly.
you never have to cash in, and it's kind of insurance in the opposite. You pay nothing,
Exactly.
pay nothing for it up front, but when you need it, you pay for it, and this is an option.
And that's why it can be a good idea for, if you want to keep a local copy of your preservation files and have a backup for in case something goes horribly wrong that you don't think is going to happen, then it can, it's not, I'm not saying it's always a terrible idea to use something like Amazon Glacier. But again,
Harvard's using Amazon.
Exactly.
I just went to their art museum, and they're like, we use Amazon for.
Yeah. Well, Amazon also, whatever the name of your vendor that you're working with, Amazon storage underlies, what's the percentage? Something more than 70% of all the actual storage, like cloud storage, that's going on. A lot of it is people working with Amazon or partnering with Amazon or building different interfaces on top of Amazon storage, but almost all of it actually goes back to Amazon. So if Amazon ever crashes, the libraries and archives of the world will be in real trouble. But for right now,
The art museum people said, and I don't know if this is true, I didn't bet anything, they said that all their, they just launched that new website, it's incredible, and you can see every piece of art, it's such detail, all the metadata, it's incredible. Their API guy is incredible, very much of a genius, but they said, oh, well, we chose it because they have their storage drives on 3 different geographical locations across the planet, so we figure one goes down in North America, the chance of the Southeast Asia, and they didn't really name I'm just making that up.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true or not, but that's why they said they chose Amazon.
Well, it may well be true, and there's
I don't
different
know.
kinds and levels of Amazon storage is the other thing. So choosing Amazon is that could mean any one of any number of things.
Yeah.
There's high quality versions of storage where they do that, where you can get, not only is it fast and it's mostly preserved and, it depends how much you pay. It all depends on how much you pay and who you're working with. So we're gonna take a break, 5-minute break, and then I'll turn it over to Casey and have great access. There's that rhyme with that razor. Yeah. So, I'm really excited to talk about this because actually copyright and rights and navigating those issues is one of my favorite things in my job. And I had no idea I would be doing this when I graduated library school. But in my job, my day-to-day job, I actually spend at least 20% of my week focusing on navigating the copyright issues to make our collection accessible. And I thought it would be really good to talk about the issues in with reference to video collections because
there are more issues when you're working with video collections and trying to make them accessible to your patrons, and we'll talk about why it's more challenging. And you might, when you graduate, you might not automatically be in a position to be able to affect change in your organization or affect, decisions or policies on making what your video collections accessible. But at least if you have a sense of the issues that are present, you might be able to, at least understand why decisions are being made, and then hopefully you'd be able to, people in your organization would know that you were familiar with these issues, and you would be able to be involved in those discussions. So let's see. So I wanted to start at the very beginning of what is copyright. We'll go through the steps of what is copyright, and then what rights owners have, what limitations there are to authorship, and then how that really affects libraries and archivists and with video collections. So we can start with United States Code Title 17, 102. So the whole copyright law is in USC Title 17. You can find all of the copyright law and all law online, but I'll just give you the citations for each of the ones that we're going to go through. But copyright protection subsists in original works of authorship that are fixed in a tangible medium of expression. And we're going to go through this whole definition and try to peel out what each word means. So what does originality mean? Originality means that the work was independently created and has at least some minimal degree of creativity. The copyright law lists different types of works that are copyrightable. Obviously, motion pictures and other audiovisual works is in that list. And but why is video so complicated? Why do I enjoy doing this on my job? Why are video collections so hard to, why are organizations so nervous about putting their stuff online and making it more broadly accessible? But for video, there are tons of different types of rights issues and other legal issues that you're going to come across. So if you think about a book, tell me what copyright ownership there might be within one published novel. Do you have any thoughts? There's going to be an author, there's going to be a publisher, and depending on the contract between the author and the publisher, one of the two is going to own the copyright. With video, you have multiple owners, possible owners. And you have, so there's directors, there's writers, producers. Often there's going to be recorded music that they've used in the program. They may be composed music that was composed specifically for that program. There might be talent unions, so if there is any talent in the program, then there might be AFTRA.
Or even if there isn't any actual talent in the program.
Yeah. And then at GVH, we deal a lot with third-party footage, especially with documentaries and news programs. There's materials that come from another source, so there are copyright issues with the third-party materials within the full program. So I just wanted to put this out there as the reason why it's so difficult and so challenging, and it's an area in which audiovisual archivists are really concerned because copyright law isn't moving fast enough, but how can we come together and make decisions on how we can make our materials more broadly available and be a force for change. So before we go into any other details, we can talk about what's not copyrightable. Facts are not copyrightable. Ideas, concepts, principles, discoveries, anything that has not been fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So in the copyright law, there's a distinction between idea and expression. Before I gave this presentation today, before I'm speaking it to you and putting it on these slides, my thoughts were an idea, but now that it is in a fixed, tangible medium of expression, I can, reserve all of my rights to this presentation, but I'm not going to.
Right on!
So there is the distinction between an idea and an expression. Expression is when it's in one of those copyrightable formats. And so if you have an idea, you want to write it down, you want to either publish it or keep it unpublished, but it's not copyrighted until it is in one of those forms. So what is authorship? initially in the author or authors of the work. The authors of a joint work are co-owners of copyright in the work. But sometimes it's hard to tell who the copyright owner is. It may be, so there have been cases in the Supreme Court where they decided, and I can't quote the cases, but they've decided that the author is the originator or the superintendent, the one who makes all of the decisions, who has the decision-making power over a work. Within that work, though, there may be copyrightable contributions to that work. So, as I said, for a full program, the originator or the person who has the decision-making authority may be the producer, but within that full program, there are going to be copyrightable elements, including like the narration, the writing, the music that was composed for the program. So, in order to determine who owns the copyright, if it was created for an organization, then there's probably going to be work. It's probably going to be a work for hire. So the actors in that program, the writer, the narrator, those are all going to probably be a work for hire. So the copyright owner is going to be the producer of the copyright to the full program will be the producer, or the person who is managing the full creation of the work. So there are works for hire. So if you're an employee of an organization, everything that you create is going to be copyrighted to that organization. But if you're an independent contractor, materials can be made as a work for hire if you're contributing to a collective work, like if you're contributing to an audio-visual work, if you're doing a translation, a compilation, if you're creating an instructional test. So if you are hired as an independent contractor and there is an agreement between you and the organization will own the copyright to those to the materials. So, but there can also be joint copyright ownership. So say a director and a producer are creating this film, and it's either going to be one of them having the final decision-making authority, or they can decide at the very beginning that it's going to be a joint copyright. Oftentimes, the Supreme Court and the judges in the district courts and the appellate courts prefer that there not be joint authorship. So in the past, they've made a decision on an ultimate copyright ownership. But for joint authorship, there are ways in which you can establish a joint authorship. And one is that from the very beginning, each party has to agree that it's going to be a joint copyright ownership, and the other requirement is that there are two or more authors to have the authorship. So once we've determined who the author of a work is, there are 4 different economic exclusive rights for copyright ownership. First is the right to reproduce or copy. Second is the right to modify or make derivatives of that work. Another example of a derivative would be if you've written a book and you want to make a motion picture version of that book. So that would be a derivative of the original. Third is the right to distribute, and distribution includes selling, giving away, loaning. Distribution in a library sense is, loaning to your patrons. And then there's the right to perform or display to the public. And in 106, the public is described as let me just back up. I would be infringing a copyright owner's work if I performed a motion picture work to the public, to a group of larger than 25, not in my own home. So if it's a public event, it's usually larger than 25 people, and it's not within my personal space. So that's why when I'm about to play an audio clip in a little while, I'm going to ask that they turn off the cameras, because it would be an infringement on this person's right to perform their work if we kept the camera on and it was then transmitted over the internet. But there are limitations to copyright. So limitations to those 4 exclusive economic rights of copyright owners. libraries and archives have exclusive limitations for distributing copyrighted works and reproducing copyrighted works. And those are found in Section 108 of the Copyright Law. Next, libraries often use 108 in conjunction with 107 as their defense, not as their defense, but as their justification for the decisions that they make in making their collections accessible. And 107 is available to everyone. It's fair use, and we'll go through the principles of fair use and the principles of Section 108. So, as I said, Section 108 are the specific limitations on copyright, specifically for libraries and archives. 108A allows libraries and archives to reproduce and distribute one copy of a work if you're doing it for nonprofit purposes, if you're providing public access to your collections, so you have to be providing public access to your collections, and not just for people within your institution, but for anyone to be able to physically come to your organization and conduct research. And when you reproduce and distribute, you have to include notice that the work is copyrighted and that you're providing this access through the provisions of 108. So 108A is often used as the basis for interlibrary law. Section 108B is the basis for archives to be able to preserve their works. Libraries and archives can reproduce 3 copies of unpublished works for preservation purposes if the copy that you're reproducing is already a part of your collection and the digital copy that you're creating is not distributed digitally outside of the physical premises of your library. Now, I know that's really scary, but we're going to talk about Section 107 in a little bit, which you can use in conjunction with 108 to justify expanding access beyond the physical premises of your library. Because obviously, you've got these digital copies, you want people to be able to see them, not have to come to your archive. So then there's Section 108C, what libraries and archives, so the last one was for unpublished works. This one is duplicating published works for purposes of preservation if the materials that you're publishing are becoming obsolete or if they're deteriorating or you've lost them. And you can do this if the unused replacement cannot be obtained at a fair price elsewhere. So if you have a 3/4-inch copy of a unique production, or you have a 2-inch copy of a unique production, if you can't find it at a fair price, a library or archive has the right to digitize this and preserve it in a different format because it is becoming obsolete. And another requirement of this is that you don't provide access to the digital copy outside of your premises, but don't worry. The copyright law also defines obsolescence, and that is that the machine or device that's necessary to render the works is no longer manufactured or reasonably available. So think of all of the video items that you have in your collection. They are becoming obsolete and they're deteriorating, and the playback machines are deteriorating. So relying on Section 108 and 108B and 108C for your digitization purposes for preservation is that's how libraries are able to move forward with those efforts. Section 108E, you can reproduce and distribute entire works to users if you determine that the copy can't be obtained by a user at a fair price. If you have no knowledge that the user is going to use it for any other purposes other than private study, research, and scholarship. If you display a copyright notice on the work that you're providing access to. And this last point is actually in 108I, but I brought it up because it is kind of related to Section 108E. But you can reproduce and distribute entire works to users or other libraries if the audio-visual motion picture deals with news, and it actually says dealing with news, but so that's something to keep in mind as well. But that's not it. We just found that we can reproduce for preservation purposes, so we can digitize our collection so that obsolete formats are migrated to the most common preservation formats, and we can provide access within the physical premises of our library. But as I said, libraries often use 107 in conjunction with 108 to to make justifications on expanding access beyond the limitations in 108. And Section 107 is available to anyone in the United States to be able to use as a defense. So you have to make the determination if you're comfortable with making materials accessible using 107, but you can't use it as like, you're not going to have to use it unless you're brought to court and you have to justify that you used 107 as your purpose for making materials accessible.
So you can't stick it up and say, you can't sue me because I have fair use. But when you are sued, you can eventually, hopefully overturn it and say, well, I won, and now you have to pay all my lawyer's fees because it was fair use, so yeah.
But fair use, the Section 107 of the copyright law says that fair use of a copyrighted work, including use by reproduction and copies or by other means, is specified in Section 106. So 106 for the exclusive rights of copyright owners. Anyone can reproduce a work for purposes of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, including classroom use, scholarship, or research, and it is not an infringement of copyright. So in determining whether a use is fair, there are 4 factors that you have to consider. First is the purpose and character of the use. Second is the nature of the copyrighted work. Third is the amount of the copyrighted work that you use. And then 4 is the effect on the potential market for that copyrighted work. And the fact that it's published or unpublished doesn't matter. You can use fair use for in both cases. So let's go into detail about each factor. So that, I wanted to show that because that case was brought to the Supreme Court in 1994. It was the Campbell versus Acuff Rose case. And in that case, Roy Orbison's producer brought Two Live Crew to court and sued them for copyright infringement because they thought that they created a derivative off of their work without his permission. And they claimed fair use. They said that the purpose of and character of the use was different. And the Supreme Court actually decided in Two Live Crew's favor. And that is the very first time that the word transformative was used, and is now like the basis of determining fair use. And transformativeness is when a use of a copyrighted work alters the original meaning and creates a new meaning, message, or expression. So this is the heart of fair use is what I think it was Ginsburg, maybe. Justice Ginsburg called fair use and said that if a use is transformative, then it actually is going to become more significant than any of the other 3 fair use factors. If it's transformative, you're probably not going to have to worry that much about the other 3 factors, and it's going to be a fair use. You don't have to consider all 4. The second is the nature of the copyrighted work, and in case law, unpublished works have tended to receive more protection than published works. One example is Harper versus The Nation, and I can't remember what year it was, but there was a biography coming out about LBJ and The Nation. Harper was the publisher. The Nation used some of the work, some quotes from the biography, and Harper sued The Nation, and they found that the Supreme Court determined that The Nation did infringe their copyright because the work that they used was the heart of the work, and it was the substantial amount, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it was the more creative piece of the work. It was a biography filled with facts, but the piece that they took was the most creative part. It was the most substantial piece of the most creative piece of the entire biography.
To be specific, if I remember right, it was a fairly juicy and scandalous part of the biography that everyone was excited to find out about, and that like broke the story before the actual biography did. I don't remember what was scandalous about it, but it was something scandalous.
Third is amount and substantiality, and when determining whether your use is fair, you want to think not just about the quantitative amount that you use, but also the qualitative amount. And in that same case, they determined that the heart of the work is more protected, and the more creative it is, the more that's the heart of the work. It's the substantial piece of the work that needs to be considered when you're making your fair use justification. Fourth is the effect on the potential market, including the loss of sales or potential licensing fees you could have received. If your use is for educational nonprofit purposes, market harm has to be demonstrated in a court of law. If it is for commercial purposes, it's going to be presumed that there was market harm. So your use in making it available beyond the physical premises of your library is going to be for nonprofit uses. And if you're not, receiving any direct funds for a patron being able to access it, then it's a little bit, well, it's not commercial at least, but you still want to make the justification on the other 4 factors. So I wanted to do an example. The first one was someone reading their own poetry, and the second one was this program that you just saw. So now what I want you to do is read the highlighted version of this agreement, and I want you to determine what you're comfortable doing with, how you're comfortable making these 2 items accessible. What can we do with the, are there any differences in what you're comfortable doing with the poetry reading and the,
I don't know what I think.
What
What did you say?
are there any differences in what you're comfortable doing with the news material and the poetry reading? So would you make a different decision on access based on those 2 types of, or based on those 2 examples?
Probably be a little more cautious with the one that had the poetry reading, because that had an additional copyrightable work that was being read in it, whereas the news production it's a little more clear cut, unless of course it's broken down into smaller rights holders. But
Okay.
I would also do some basic research and see if the poet is trying to sell that poem anyway. Because if they are, then you can be pretty certain that there's probably public copyright.
Anyone else?
Well, this is a question. Is it the kind of thing that, is it likely or possible that she signed some kind of agreement when she agreed to appear on the show that addressed these issues?
That may have
directly?
addressed issues. So in my experience, she may have signed an agreement giving the rights to broadcast it at that one time. But back then, they really didn't sign agreements giving online use, because it didn't exist at that time, or archival rights, or making it accessible in an archive.
And what about contacting her with
Well,
regards
let's
to this?
say you've got 30,000 items that you just did, for example.
Just a random number off the top of your head.
30,475.
What if you have like 500, if you got a collection of 500 poetry readings from one series, you might be able to assign someone from your staff to contact and clear rights for making it available online. So it depends on the scope. But anyone else? Reading this highlighted section, what do you think you have the right to do? Are you putting it online because you have the right to do it, or what do you think you have the rights to do, and then are you having to make a fair use justification for putting it online?
I'd say putting it online and fair use later.
Okay. All right, let's read through the language. So we've got a non-exclusive, perpetual, royalty-free license to utilize, copy, and display, and here's a limitation, to the fullest extent of archival rights reflected in the copyright law. So we can utilize it, copy it, and display it to the fullest extent of archival rights, that's section 108, reflected in the copyright law. So basically, in my opinion, I think that, I don't know what utilize means, but we can copy, we can reproduce it, and we can display it according to the provisions in 108. So when we just went through 108, we realized that we could create 3 digital copies for preservation purposes. And then we can also display it, we have to display it to the public within the physical premises of our library. We can't do anything else with it. And then you brought up the other section, section 108E, which was actually which I brought into that slide, but you can make an entire work available to users or people or other libraries if the motion picture deals with news. So I actually didn't think of that, and I should have brought that up at my rights meeting 6 months ago. And we made this determination for the archive. So basically, they're giving us archival rights. And then we can read the next statement. We can provide access to works in its possession free of charge or subject to a nominal fee to support the archive's cost, but it does not authorize commercial exploitation. And we shall retain copies of any copyright identification or other attribution. So we need to give attribution to the copyright owner. But I don't see anywhere in here about making it available online. It says we can make it available for nonprofit purposes, but it doesn't really specify any access beyond the physical premises. And I wouldn't be comfortable with putting it up online.
So I imagine at GBH you have a lot of older material that you may or may not be digitizing that was created before the current dissemination platforms. So what do you do about that? I mean, it didn't exist at the time, so how can you be, so are you bound not to display something on something that didn't exist at the time that the agreement was made, or?
We are displaying it within the physical premises of our library, so you can come and look at it. And then at GBH, for the materials that we're digitizing, we, for our own, internal purposes, we're making all of our news collections available online. And we are, for any other types of material, like a cooking show or an instructional program, we go back and clear rights. And we do have contracts. A lot of the stations that I work with have no contracts, none whatsoever. They have no idea what agreements there were when it was broadcast. So for my project, I'm working with 100 different stations, and we digitized their material, and now we're trying to figure out how to make it more broadly accessible. We are using 108 in conjunction with 107, and making determinations using both of those provisions.
And I'm just going to jump in and say, oh, sorry, you had a question.
What about defunct organizations? Does it then revert to the people, and then do you get death plus 75 or whatever? And what about government money, stuff made with government money?
I don't have the answer to that.
Those are good questions. Defunct organizations is the question about orphan works. So there's a lot of argument back and forth in the courts about what the status should be of orphan works, where the copyright owner can't be determined because, for example, it was made with a defunct organization that no longer exists legally. So there have been a lot of pushes to give, especially libraries and archives, more rights over what they can do with orphan works when the copyright owners can't be determined. There was a big lawsuit with the Happy Trust, if you guys are familiar with that, when they digitized a whole bunch of books that were orphan works. And then the Authors Guild of America found one person who owned one of those books to use as a figurehead for a lawsuit, and it's gone back and forth for years. I believe it did actually resolve, and I should know how it resolved.
It resolved in favor.
Yeah, in favor of Happy Trust.
Yeah.
But what if it's not person that's because then you've got public domain death plus 75, I think it is now or something?
It doesn't.
Organization?
It doesn't have to be a person. The author as the organization. So it would still be copyrighted for life. Well, I guess
Well, if it was done by corporate, I'm trying to remember this off the top of my head. I believe a work that has a corporate author where it's not a person, it's just 90 years from the date of creation. So there's no death plus author. I could be getting that number wrong.
Yeah.
But I believe it's 90 years from the date of creation if the author is corporate. Because there's no way to determine the death of a corporation. A corporation could go on for years and years and years.
Is it different for unpublished and published?
Yes, I believe that is also true. I can't,
I
without
think
looking it up.
unpublished was 120
Yeah.
from, I think. But there are all the information about the length of copyright since like 1909 was the first,
Right.
1999.
But yes, your instincts are 100% correct. It is different when it's done by a corporation. It is different when the corporation goes defunct. It gets really complicated when it's orphaned.
But Rose made a very good, point in our talk was, once you put your shows up online, on the archive, the American Public Archive, or anybody can hack it and do it. I mean,
Well, that's secondary
you're distributing. Once you go up online, you have no control over
Yeah, we're
it.
going to talk about direct infringement and secondary liability, and you're making a risk when you're putting it online because that's a direct infringement. It could be a direct infringement if you're sued and they find that you are in fact infringing, if your fair use case doesn't work out. But then if someone uses the material that you put online, that is a second type of risk that you're taking, which could lead to secondary liability, which could include contributory infringement or vicarious liability, which we'll talk about in just a second.
Well, I just wanted to ask about, I read display as, put it on the internet so people can watch it, and you just said that doesn't, is that?
Well, I read it as utilize, copy, and display, and then the next clause was a limitation to the fullest extent possible within the archival rights. So the fullest extent
Doesn't
possible
include-
for display is physical on premises.
But that's a really good point too, because a lot of people have argued cases in copyright law based on just this kind of word factors. There's a lot of room, there's a lot of wiggle room in any of these contracts and any of the copyright clauses, and some of them are left purposefully vague. Like the fair use clauses are left very purposefully vague, so that you can try and wiggle your way out of them. And then it's basically, in a lot of cases, they've left it up to the courts to decide, no, we think this is what is meant, no, we think that is what is meant. So you could make that argument, and it might be a valid one, you might win. And it's a question of, a
What
lot
risk
of
you're
times,
willing to take, and do you want to get sued?
and it's a question of what risk your organization is willing to take a lot of the time. If you're an archivist in a large organization, then a lot of times you're gonna have a legal team, and they're gonna say, no, this is too risky, we can't do this. If you're in a small organization, where maybe you don't have a legal team, and maybe there's just like 5 of you, then a lot of times you might be like, heck yeah, who's gonna sue us?
You have to just think who is going to get mad at us. If you're like a nonprofit educational institution and you have a staff of 5 people and you put it online and no one, like, are they ever going to see it? Are they going to get mad when they see it? If they do, and we'll talk about some of the steps you can take to safeguard yourself and make sure that if someone is aware of an infringement, they can just contact you and you can speak with them and take it down. So takedown notices are often used by libraries and archives if you don't know, if you're not fully aware of the copyright issues, but you're going to take the risk of putting it online. But something else I wanted to do was, so that was an agreement that we decided ultimately that we wanted to go a step further and ensure that we had the right to make it more broadly available. So we actually ended up sending all of our participating organizations a quit claim, which is like an agreement, but basically it's just very broad and it doesn't indemnify the organization. And we asked them to give us the right, to the extent that they can, to make it available in our online reading room for research, educational, and informational purposes. So we actually went back to the stations and asked for them, for their rights to the extent that they own them, so that we can make it available online. But that leaves all the third-party issues that we talked about earlier. So then we go into the next steps of, now let's make a fair use analysis of the third-party materials within the full programs for which we do have the right to put it online, but are we going to take the risk of putting the full program online when there may be,
Multiple uses.
multiple sources within that program?
Especially PBS, man. They would, this orchestra piece with that film clip and da-da-da, and everybody's like, hey, just put it in, who cares,
All
Well,
right.
that's the problem that we, at WGBH, we have a legal team as part of our archive. And
Yeah.
they're constantly banging their heads against people trying to license bits of a program they have no idea where it is.
Right.
Or just being like, well, it came off the internet, so it's fine. You can use that, right?
Well, they've been sued a whole lot and lost too.
Yeah.
That's why they had that big team.
All right, so,
Now what do we do?
They're not very case, we got it.
all right, right, so we've got 10 minutes, I've got a lot more to go through. So this is another, so that was the deed of gift that we got for our first collection that we received. We created this new deed of gift after we went through that and decided we didn't get the rights that we wanted the first time. So we want to make our next deed of gift for the new collections that we're receiving more broad and making sure that we're getting the rights that we want. Number one is the transfer of ownership. That's where the donor donates the physical or digital, in our case, objects. So you have physical property ownership of those materials. You don't have the copyright ownership, but you have the ownership of those materials. And in the past, libraries have done like permanent loans of their collections, which is a big issue. You may have seen like a whole big discussion on it on the archives listserv a couple of weeks ago. But permanent loans are not recommended anymore because now you're having to spend tons of money digitizing these collections. You want to make sure that you own the materials. It's not on a loan from a donor that they can, take back one day. So number two, this is where the copyright owner can tell you what copyright they have within the full program or within the full items. They can tell you if they own everything, some of it, or none of it. And then you can have an exhibit to this where they can provide more detailed information about, they might be able to say, well, I know that there's ABC footage in this one program. Here you're able to, get a little bit of information on what your issues you're going to face. Then two is the assignment of rights. So you have the ownership of the materials in one, but now you want them to assign a license or rights for you to make them, you preserve them and make them available. So here you can go through. They assign all rights. So A is where they're transferring their copyright to you. They're never going to sign that. B is they're putting them in the public domain. That's a Creative Commons 1.0 universal license. We'll talk about that in a minute if we have time. Number three is the one that most are going to sign, I think, hopefully, so we can grow our collection. But we included all of these potential uses for us, including cataloging, preservation, copying and migration for preservation and access purposes, exhibition, display, and making works available for non-commercial public access, including online in accordance with the donor's policy and with applicable law. Okay, so now we have everything that we want. We can preserve it, we can catalog it, we can copy it, we can exhibit it, we can display it, make it available non-commercially, including online. So that's what I'm trying to tell you is for deeds of gift, you want to make sure that you're getting the rights you want up front and having those negotiations with the donor from the beginning so that 5 years from now, when you're not at their organization anymore, or if you're there, you don't have to spend hours and hours and weeks of your time trying to figure out who to go to get the rights you want. So reuse of donated materials by patrons is another section that you can have to let the donor authorize patrons different types of uses for the material. Once you're able to make it available online, what then can the patrons do with it? And we listed all of the Creative Commons licenses here, which I'll talk about in just a second. So there are different levels. So Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization that has created licenses for copyright owners to use and assign to the public for reuse, the public or whoever they're licensing their materials to, for reuse of their copyrighted materials. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then metadata, you always want to get the metadata from the donor, and I'll talk a little bit. Well, I'll just say that at GBH, we try to get as much metadata from the donor as possible to begin with so that it reduces the amount of cataloging we have to do, especially with our collection being so huge. So if they're able to give you metadata, you definitely want them to put that in the public domain. So now we've done that exercise. Okay, so I guess we don't have that much time, but I wanted to then do a fair use analysis of those two examples and go through the 4 factors and try to determine if we only have rights to make it available on our physical premises, would we use fair use to make it more broadly available, like putting it in our online reading room? And I'll just quickly go through those 4 questions. Purpose and character of the use. It's transformative. So we're looking for transformativeness. I would say that the news program that you just saw is, when you're putting it available when you're making it available in your online reading room, you are putting it up there for a completely different purpose than it was originally intended. It was originally intended back in 1965 for people to know about what was happening in South Boston, so that they could know, to avert traffic or, become an activist in that cause. But now, when you're making it available in your online reading room, you're putting it up there for scholars and researchers to understand what was happening back in 1965. And in my opinion, that's transformative. I'm not a legal counsel, I should have said that earlier, but this is not giving any legal advice, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer.
Say that again faster.
So for the poetry reading though, I would think that if I was going to watch that program in 1970 and hear that poet read her work, if I was going to put that online, people would probably listen to it for the same purposes, for entertainment purposes. So in my opinion, that wouldn't have been a transformative use. So we already determined that the news was transformative, so as I said, those other three factors aren't as significant anymore. Once you've determined transformativeness, you're pretty golden. But the nature of the copyrighted work, the unpublished works tend to receive more protection. There's a lot of, we had like a long discussion back in October when we had our big rights meeting on whether or not television is published or unpublished. And I think we determined that it was unpublished, but that's not an area of expertise that I have. But the more creative the work, the more protection it tends to receive. So that poetry reading was definitely more creative than the news. Amount and substantiality, we're looking at the qualitative amount that's used, or the heart of the work, the creative portions. I would say the news, well, we've already determined that it's transformative, and we'd like to put up the entire program. But since it's transformative, I feel like we could put it online and not have to worry about this factor. But for the other one, we're making available an entire poetry reading, 4 different poems that she read, and they're very creative, and it is the heart of her work. So I'm not comfortable with that. Effect and use on the potential market, you brought up that she might still be wanting to sell those programs, or sell her poetry. So we would be infringing her right to publicly perform her work, because we would be transmitting it online, and also we would be infringing her right to make a market value, or make market profit off of it. So it is for educational nonprofit purposes, but we've already determined that those other factors, we didn't feel comfortable with poetry reading. So in my opinion, we would put the news program online, and I wouldn't be comfortable putting the poetry reading online unless we were able to secure the rights that we wanted from the station, or who created the work, but also from the poet.
So all the entertainment stuff that you've had submitted, you're not putting online? Okay.
And it depends where you are. I used to work with the Dance Heritage Coalition before I came to WGBH, and we created an online reading room, which we're kind of still in the process of distributing, but it was all dance materials, only our putting it up. Because we're a small organization, we don't have a legal counsel. We have a strong notice to take down, which Casey's going to talk about in a second.
And we have good relationships with the dance companies.
Good relationship with the dance companies who provided their works to be preserved and made accessible. So even though we don't have firm legal agreements saying that they're assigning the rights to us, let alone all the subsidiary rights like music and costume design and so forth, we decided to take that risk.
And a lot of the material that you were doing with the Dance Heritage Coalition, you were making it password protected to member organizations that had dance collections. So other libraries and archives, patrons could go to those libraries and archives and access those materials, but they couldn't access them anywhere else. So that
For teaching and research.
For teaching and research. So I talked about Creative Commons, and when we were looking at that deed of gift, as I said, Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization that has created several different licenses that anyone can use to relinquish some of the rights that they have for the public to be able to share and reuse their copyrighted works. I started with attribution. That is the most accommodating of all licenses. You can do whatever you want with it. You can make derivatives, you can share it, you can distribute it, as long as you give attribution to the copyright owner. And it can go all the way down to attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives, and that's the most restrictive. But still, I would be, pretty happy with getting any of these, as opposed to not having any rights at all for reuse purposes. This is a slide from the Harvard Law School's Copyright X course, but I really liked it because copyright subsists from the moment of creation, federal protection, so if you decide to publish it, and then, or it's unpublished, it doesn't have to be published, then life plus 70 years. But if you use one of these Creative Commons licenses, you're kind of lowering the bar a little bit and providing those works for reuse and distribution for other purposes, and not reserving all of the rights. And then the public domain is the very bottom. But as I said earlier, we went through the fair use analysis. But really, it all comes down to a risk analysis and figuring out who's going to get mad. So when I said earlier also, when you're putting these materials online, if you're brought to court, you could be sued for direct infringement of their rights by putting them online. But you could also, if someone takes that poetry reading and they download it and they start selling copies of it all over the place and they make all this money, they would be directly infringing the work, but you would be responsible for secondary liability, which can include contributory infringement and vicarious liability. Both in contributory infringement and vicarious liability require direct infringement, so it requires the user to download it and then sell it and make all this money off of it and infringe the work. But then contributory infringement requires knowledge by the defendant. So you have to know that this person downloaded it. There are ways that you can try to reduce your knowledge, and so by like having a takedown notice, or not having a takedown notice, but having a rules of use in your online reading room that say that we're making this available for research, private study, and educational purposes, and any other use is your responsibility to clear. So that's kind of relinquishing the responsibility for you a little bit. You can use that as a defense. But then there's material contribution. Obviously, if you're putting it online, you're contributing the material. Then there's vicarious liability, which also requires direct infringement, but it also requires financial interest in the infringement. But if you're putting it available for non-commercial purposes, then there's no financial interest. So you're not going to, so this doesn't apply. And then the right and ability to supervise the direct infringer. This doesn't apply to archives because you're actually putting the material in your online reading room, but like YouTube and other service providers who have other people put material online, they could be responsible for vicarious liability because people can purchase ads for the content that's online. Some of that would go to YouTube, and then the right and ability to supervise the direct infringer. This is where that online service provider should have a really strong takedown notice and a contact person for people to contact YouTube and tell them that their rights have been infringed. So they have the ability to supervise the direct infringer. They could remove them as a user from YouTube. YouTube, I think, has been sued for vicarious liability before. But Section 512 of copyright law is the statutory safe harbors for online service providers, which provides some provisions for online service providers as long as you follow a few requirements, which include big takedown notice and having the determined representative identified for contact about copyright infringement. But really the only thing you need to worry about is contributory infringement, not vicarious liability. So sorry for going into all that detail. Okay, we're almost done. So suggestions, first off, get the rights to the extent that the donor can give you the rights to put it online. At least you then have, if they own the copyright to the full work, then at least you have those rights. Then all you have to worry about is the stuff in like the third-party content. Then document the fair use analysis and rights that you have. Have an internal document describing the justification for why you determine that you can make this available in your online reading room. If you don't have that written down and you're not there 5 years from now, it's going to put your institution in a really difficult position if they get sued, because they won't know, they won't have that justification. What we've done at GBH is we had very minimal metadata for all of our content, but we wanted to make it more broadly accessible. So we can't go through and catalog it to the fullest extent, but we can assign genres to it by looking at the titles and the little descriptions that we do, the few descriptions that we do have. And then we can easily determine, like, is this news or is this a public performance of the Beatles? So we've assigned genres, and we have created genres, and we've defined those genres and of different types of material that we have found in our collection. And we have green lit, caution, and red lit, different genres. So we know if it has a news genre, if it has a talk show, if it has a event coverage or interview with a public figure, we know we're putting that in our online reading room. And I can send you that information. Let's see. Put a big takedown notice on your digital archive website and have a representative that someone can contact to inform you of any infringement. And then you can negotiate with them and figure out if they are the copyright owner, and if so, you can take it down. Make users acknowledge your rules of use, and we're going to do this by having them acknowledge it by clicking through. If you have like the terms of use at the very bottom of the website on the footer that nobody's ever going to look at, it's better to have it, very visible, and at least they'll have to click through it and acknowledge it, whether or not they read it, but you've made it a little more visible. And then applying multiple levels of access for different types of content. So there are some things that you might be comfortable putting in your online reading room, but there may be other genres that you're not as comfortable making so broadly accessible, but maybe you're comfortable providing a scholar with a .edu address, a password protected file that may be limited for a certain period of time. So that's technologically another thing that you can do, and one example is box.com. I think you have to have a subscription to it, but it lets you share content, password protected. I think time restricted, I'm not sure. But that's another layer of protection that you can put. And then understanding the difference, understanding what streaming is. This is really important because in your deeds of gift, you might say, we've determined that we're saying including online instead of including streaming, because there are two. So I don't know if you're familiar with streaming and progressive download, but most video access that you receive on the internet is progressively downloaded. That means that when you watch the file, it's being pulled down from a server and stored in a local temporary file on your computer. And it's actually being downloaded onto your computer. And you might notice in the scroll bar that when you scroll, you can't scroll all the way to the end until it's loaded all the way. That's until it's downloaded to your computer. So you're actually downloading it. And it's less secure. So the other type of streaming is streaming. And that's a lot more expensive. It's more secure, but you'll see that. And it's kind of hard to tell, or actually it's pretty easy to tell when you go online. If an organization is streaming their content, the whole file is going to load automatically. You won't have to wait for it. You won't be able to download it. So it's a lot more expensive, and you're probably going to have to end up using progressive download. But so you need to make sure that your legal agreements don't say otherwise, and also that you're able to communicate that with your donors, because you want to be transparent about what you're really going to be doing with it. So here's the resources. I'll just quickly go through these. The Code of Best Practices in Fair Use for Academic and Research Libraries is excellent. Peter Hurdle, anyone ever heard of him? All right, he is a rock star. He is an archivist by education, but he has become the leading expert in copyright for archives and libraries. So I definitely recommend Copyright and Cultural Institutions, and it's available for free online. Copyright X course. Rebecca and I just finished that last week, and it was a semester-long course with Harvard Law School. It was a free course, it was online, and we learned a lot. A lot of what I talked about today I got from that class. Then the copyright term and public domain in the United States. This is a really good chart that Peter Fraimow made that tells you the different formalities and the duration of copyright based on the time that it's created. Then Title 17 of the U.S. Code is available all here on the Cornell website. It's available elsewhere too, but I find this the best interface. And then GBH created a flow chart for digitizing news collections in collaboration with the Berkman Center at Harvard Law School, and the flow chart is available here. And we'll share the slides so you don't have to write down tomorrow.
And we've also just got resources for the tech stuff, which again, this will be shared. I'm not going to go through it, but information on the technical details, on what your best practices are going to be if you're dealing with born digital, what your best practices are going to be if you're dealing with digitizing video, and how to find out what codec does what. Library of Congress has a list of various codecs. Not all of them, because there are a lot, but many of them that list some of the technical characteristics and whether they kind of give it their Library of Congress seal of approval or not. Yeah, thank you guys so much. I'm sorry we kept you a little bit late.